Welcome back. Now straight to business. Before the engine goes back in the frame, I'm going to do the valve clearances. I've got no record or history on the bike to tell me when this was last done, plus I also lapped the valves when I was doing the rebuild, so I'm expecting them to be on the tight side. I drew out a quick sketch of the valve locations and marked them up with the cylinder numbers as well as the intake and exhaust. I made a note of the specified clearances and busted out the feeler gauge to measure the exhaust side. 0.2mm is a bit loose, 0.25 wouldn't go in, and 0.23 was nice and snug. I made a note and I ticked it as in spec. I worked through all the rest that were accessible with the camshafts in this position, as you can only measure the ones where the lobes aren't contacting the bucket. Then I turned the crankshaft through a full rotation, which due to the 2:1 ratio of the timing system, rotates the camshafts 180 degrees, exposing the remaining clearances to check. With them all checked, out of 16, only 7 were out of spec, although plenty were on the tighter side of the tolerance. Do you know what? It's quite funny, right? When I last did the valve clearances, which was on the ZX7R, I remember being like, oh, timing, I've got to make sure the timing's right, and I was just so nervous about everything because, like, I don't want to disturb the magic of the engine. But now, let me tell you, because I've taken this engine apart, every single piece, looked at it, understood it all, to know how it works, all this sort of thing, right? I just, I've still got so much respect for it all and how important and fragile things are, like these bearing caps, but it's not daunting anymore. Like, I just know what I need to do with this. I've got no issues with setting the timing of this when I put it back together. So yeah, just an interesting difference that I notice about doing this compared to doing it on the SLR. I removed the bearing caps and the camshafts and placed the buckets with their shims in their positions on my diagram. The size markings of the shims had long since worn off, plus it's a good practice to measure them properly to determine their exact size, so I went through them all, making a note of the shim size in each location. I took a picture and fed it all into my spreadsheet. I start with adding the measured clearances into this table, highlighting the ones out of spec. Then I feed the measured size of the current shims into the second table. Then I write out all 16 shim sizes that I have to play with on the left, and then begin sticking them into different locations in this third table, allowing the spreadsheet to do the maths and project the new clearances. I colour them red where I've been able to reuse existing ones, and then for the remainder I type the correct size of the shims that I'd need to order to make the correct clearance. This then gives me a list of shims I need to order. So I jumped on Wiimoto and I ordered the 7 that I need. And here they are. I check that they're all the right ones, and then I draw out a new clean diagram and start putting them into their new locations, pulling out the shims I'm reusing from the original locations, consulting my spreadsheet as I go. I gave the tops of the valve stems a dab of lube each, then began transferring the shims from the diagram into their new locations in the head. With the shims in, I lubed up and inserted the buckets back in. Now the eagle-eyed may have noticed one missing, as stupidly when entering the measured sizes into my spreadsheet, I misread this scribble and now needed one more shim. Problem is, it's Saturday morning on a bank holiday weekend, so anything I order now won't be here till Tuesday at the earliest. I rode the short 40-minute ride over to Wiimoto, said hello to my bike's 750cc bigger brother, and came out triumphant. Man, I love that bike. Anyway, problem solved, let's crack on. With the last shim and bucket in, I refitted the camshafts, torqued up the cam caps, and gave them all a quick recheck to make sure they're all now on the looser end of the specified range. I fitted the cam chain tensioner, and then applied a smear of silicone to the half-moon areas of the gasket surface. The manual also calls for a smear on each of the spark plug tunnels before fitting the seals. I laid the new gasket on, pressing down into the grooves, and I checked it was all correctly positioned. I laid a few drops of sealant to help keep the new upper cam chain guide in place. And then with a smear of engine oil on the clean air pipes, I pressed the valve cover down over the top. The cover bolts cleaned up nicely, so I fitted them and torqued them all up to spec. Just for peace of mind, now everything's buttoned up, I spanned the engine over a few more times to double check all moves smoothly, and then gathered a load more engine ancillaries onto the bench to work out what I needed to fit now and what was best leaving until it's in the frame. I'm not going to fit any of this yet, nor these bits, as they'll need some TLC beforehand. To be honest, the same can be said for all of this stuff. The starter and alternator can go on later too, so I gathered together and cleaned up the mounting bolts and spacers and put on my big boy pants. Similar to how I removed the engine, I'm going to lower the frame down over the engine using the skylift. Great, there's my table. The plan is transfer this onto there. That wasn't too bad. I threaded the spacers all the way in to give maximum clearance for the engine as the frame comes down. I quickly realised my table wasn't going to be high enough as the front wheel had contacted the floor long before it was even close to being in position. So I rebuilt my table a bit higher and tried again. With the rear mounts in position, I dropped the aluminium spacer in and fed the upper rear mounting bolt through. There we go. Right. Uno. The bottom wasn't quite lined up as the frame wasn't perfectly level, but I was able to pivot the frame by pressing down on the subframe until it lined up enough to slide the bolt through. With these bolts all the way through, I could fit the front two bolts into their location. Then I pressed the rear bolts back through an inch or two to make room for the hex bit to then thread the rear collars in until they touch the frame. With those torqued up, I could now take both the front bolts out and thread their collars in until they lightly touch the head on both sides. Then I torqued them up. I threaded the lock nuts on loosely before slotting in the nuts and tightening the bolts all the way up to spec. I did the same thing on the rear mounts. Then I busted out my customised socket to tighten the collar lock nuts up to spec, so that should be everything. Right then, boys and girls, let's start with a gentle we now have an engine in a frame. Would you look at that? Then I turned my attention back to the workbench full of dirty parts and made a start on cleaning up the oil pipe and replacing the O-rings. Next up, the coolant pipe. The coolant protects the inside from corrosion, but the outside was in need of a fresh protection, so I gave it a quick sandblast and a coat of high temp paint. I replaced the O-rings and fitted it back onto the bike, as well as the oil pipe. Although I'll need to replate this bolt for sure. Yeah. No, this isn't going to do. We'll have to do that bolt again. The old neutral switch had cracked when removing, so I picked up a new one and fitted a new O-ring. I inserted the spring and the plunger that completes the circuit with the contact on the switch when in neutral, giving you that lovely light on the dashboard. The aluminium manifolds on the clean air system needed a clean-up, so I pulled them off and gave them a sandblast. The intake rubbers were still nice and supple with no cracks, so I'll reuse these, but I will replace the O-rings. Then I turned my attention to the oil cooler. It had quite a bit of surface corrosion, but I thought I'd see what a bath in Deox sieve could do to bring it back. Turns out quite a lot. The bolt cleaned up well, but the sealing washer was quite tired, and of course these are no longer available from Kawasaki. But a little research online told me that these are called Doughty washers, so I ordered one in the right spec. I fitted a new O-ring and fitted the oil cooler back onto the crankcase, making sure the notch lined up with the locating tabs. With the oil cooler torqued up, I fitted the cleaned up coolant manifold onto the cylinder block. Next up were the intake rubbers. Now that the engine was all closed up, I was even more conscious of dropping anything down these, so I 3D printed some plugs to pop in the ports in the meantime. I sourced replacement bolts for the pickup cover plate, and I found a plate in much better condition on eBay. I also grabbed a new gasket and cleaned up the wiring, then fitted it back to the engine. I used a dab of sealant here to avoid any oil leaks around the wire and grommet. Then I fitted a new oil pressure switch with a dab of thread sealant on the threads. Last but not least, I laid out all the parts from the sump, with new O-rings for the oil pipes, freshly zinc plate bolts, and of course a new gasket. Then I fitted the two oil relief valves, torquing them up to spec. I fit the new O-rings on the distribution pipe and pressed it onto the 3 holes. You're in. Ooh, you're in. Funny guy. No. Fit you first and then it squishes in. I fit a new seal on the strainer. This was quite filthy in stride, but cleaned up quite nicely. I fit the O-ring with a dab of grease to hold it still, And with a couple of bolts to keep the gasket in place, I fitted the sump. So, what do we think, people? Hey, how about that? Let's not worry ourselves with crazy, silly questions like, will it ever run again? We'll deal with that down the line. But let's just remember that when I first put this bike on the lift all those months ago, I thought I was probably just going to be doing a bit of a tidy up, digging things out, making sure it was all clean and working properly. Now I'm looking at my first ever full engine rebuild. I'm pretty happy with that. So what's next? I've got a loom. I'm going to go through that thoroughly. I'm going to make sure all the major electrical components like the alternator and the starter motor are properly functioning, they're clean, they're looking good. And then I'm going to start fitting all that stuff and the main loom while everything's so accessible on the bike. But in the meantime, I'm going to crack open a well-deserved beer and stare at this. Look, I'm not asking you to like make 180 horsepower. I just run. So that's it. I just want you to. What? Yeah. Mate. I know. This.